Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink. Joined this week by Dylan Burkhardt of UMHoops, who I originally wanted to have on, as many of you who listen to the podcast know. Typically in the off-season, we go around to each Big Ten school and try to get an update on what's happening with those respective programs. But rather than just talking Michigan, we had some off-season, I guess all-decade team come out from the Big Ten Network that I wanted to get Dylan's thoughts on to break that down. So welcome back to the podcast, Dylan. Happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Is there anything that screams quarantine content more than an all-decade team? I feel like that's on brand.
Well, we did some quarantine content of our own on Inside the Hall when we did the all-time greatest Hoosier. So I don't feel like I don't have the credibility to knock the concept that much. Although I do have some takes on these three teams. So for anybody who hadn't seen it, I'm just going to give this a quick rundown. The Big Ten Network had 24 people, and I've seen the list of the people, although I don't believe the individual ballots were released. But it's a mixture of media, former players, former coaches. I think John Beilein and Tim Miles are both on there. Basically, they were asked to give their all-decade teams for Big Ten basketball. So basically anybody that played from 2010 to 2020. My understanding is that current players were not included in this, so like Luka Garza and Xavier Tillman, etc. Although neither one of maybe Garza had an argument, but no one else probably had an argument to be included. So they released the teams this week. There's 5 players on the first team, 5 on the second, and 6 on the third due to a tiebreak. So quick rundown. First team: Frank Kaminsky, Trey Burke, Draymond Green, Denzel Valentine, Evan Turner. Second team: Cassius Winston, Victor Oladipo, Carson Edwards, Ethan Happ, Jared Sullinger. And third team: Aaron Craft, Caleb Swanigan, D'Angelo Russell, Jawan Johnson, Jordan Murphy, and Yogi Ferrell. So Dylan, I'm gonna let you go first. But do you have any issue with players that were missing from this list? Is there anybody that you look at and say for sure should have been on there? Before I get to the names that I see that are on there that maybe didn't belong to be on there, I'm just curious if there's anybody missing notable that you feel should have been on this list.
So first, a couple things that I've learned about this list. First off, everyone who voted only voted for 10 players. So I think that created a bit of an issue on the third team where guys who might have been higher on some ballots and they might have a claim to be maybe a second teamer in someone's mind might have gone above someone who's maybe a little more consistently in that 11 to 15 range. So I think that created a little bit of extra variability, especially with the third team, just because you don't get to see sort of that smooth curve of these guys might have racked up a lot of 13th place votes, and actually this guy who some people put 10th might have only been on half the ballots. So you lost that. And I think if you look at the first two teams, I think it's hard to have any major beef. The first team, I think everyone who is nominated on that team at least won one National Player of the Year award. So that's pretty much a lock, right? Do you have an issue with that list?
No, I mean, and even I think I don't know if Winston won any National Player of the Year awards, but Victor Oladipo did win one, I think, smaller National Player of the Year. So I agree with you. Like the first team is, and the other thing you have to remember is we're talking about college careers. A lot of people are going to look at this and say, well, so-and-so was the number 10 pick or whatever, throwing just an arbitrary number out there. Again, this was looking at college careers. But yeah, I agree with you. I think the first team is, as rock solid as it gets. You've got, to me, it would be interesting to kind of see the breakdown of the voting of who got the most first place votes from that list.
And
but all of them are well deserving.
And they are putting out a player of the year, I believe, on Friday.
Okay.
So I guess we will see who's the top pick. I think the second team, Oladipo, like you said, he did get that one player of the year award. So he's the only guy who won any player of the year award, I think, nationally, and didn't make the first team. So he's a lock for the second team. Jerod Sullinger, lock for the second team. Cassius Winston, when I first saw the list, I really thought that he should be on the first team ahead of Denzel Valentine. Looking back on it, I think you can make a pretty clear case either way, and Valentine ended up with the more notable kind of career accolades that I think pretty clearly went into making this list.
Mm-hmm.
What was your thoughts on Ethan Happ and Carson Edwards filling out that team?
I think I have
Those
more
might be a little more.
I think I have more of a problem with Edwards being on there than Happ, based on the longevity of the career. And I don't want to take anything away from what Carson Edwards did at Purdue, but I look at the rest of the players on this list. Cassius Winston was not only a great scorer, he was a great distributor. He didn't just do one thing well. Ethan Happ kind of did a little bit of everything. Jerod Sullinger, Oladipo. Carson Edwards, to me, was a really good college player who scored a lot of points, but I don't know if he's the same caliber in terms of all-around performance as the other guys on this list. So if I was going to take one name off the second team, I think it would be Carson Edwards.
So here's the argument for Carson Edwards. He was a two-time All-American, two-time first-team All-Big Ten. He won 2 Big Ten titles and made the second weekend of the NCAA tournament 3 times. And Purdue was 45-11 when he was there in the Big Ten. I mean, when you look at those,
those are awesome numbers.
Someone else would say, well, he shot 38% from the field his junior year and took 100 shots, but his team was still good. He had that NCAA tournament run. So I had the same reaction with Carson Edwards, but when you look at it, it's like, all right, well, ethan when you balance all that out, he does belong on the list. I think.
Did you have any problem with any of the other names in the second team?
Ethan Happ was a 3-time first-team All-Big Ten player. I think that speaks on that. I think Sullinger might have the best argument to have not been on the first team, or like the biggest beef with that pick. He played 2 years and won everything. I think he was 2-time first-team All-American. He's a guy that you kind of forget how productive he was after the fact. So, no, I don't really have a problem with the second team. I think overall, they got the top 10 players pretty much spot on.
So third team.
Third team is where.
Well, see, this is the thing I didn't know. It was good that you brought it up. I didn't know that they only ranked 10 players. So this is where it kind of even makes it more alarming to me that somebody would vote Jordan Murphy in their top 10. To me, you want to talk about the ultimate stat counting guy on this list. He's it, right? I mean, what did Minnesota objectively? They made the second round of the tournament one year with him on the team. Is that right? They lost to Michigan State. Other than that, I mean, yes, he rebounded a lot, and he was a good player. But I mean, is he? This is kind of what I said yesterday. I mean, if you think that he's better than Cody Zeller, then to me that's just kind of a garbage take. But I mean, that's. To me, I mean, the other names, I can see a case for all of them. Aaron Kraft, I mean, maybe not statistically, but in the eyes of many, he was this glue guy that kept Ohio State apart and was a pesky defender. And Caleb Swanigan, I think, was a Big Ten Player of the Year, right?
Mm-hmm.
D'Angelo Russell, that one maybe have a problem with. He was a one and done on a team that wasn't all that great. He put up great numbers. And then Yogi, obviously, I think that's more of a career achievement type award. But, he was the all-time assist leader at IU, played 4 years, won 2 Big Ten titles. I can get that. Juwan Johnson, don't have a strong opinion on that one or the other. But to me,
another Big Ten Player of the Year.
Yeah, so, Murphy's the one to me that's like, all right, if we're voting top 10 and you put Jordan Murphy on there, then I'd really like to know the rationale behind that.
So D'Angelo Russell really makes sense when you consider the voting. You can probably make a case that he's easily one of the 10 most talented players to play in the Big Ten in the last decade, and he was really good that year. So he's one of those guys who you'd say a lot of people might not even pick, but some people can make a case that he belongs in the top 10. So I get that. I can't get behind Jordan Murphy or Aaron Craft on this team. There are too many good players who were just completely excluded from the list, and there's just no real case to be made. I will say that it's pretty on brand for the Big Ten Network because Jordan Murphy and Aaron Craft were probably two of the most talked about players on BTN during their times there, right? So I see that, and they were notable, but you can't, there's too many players of the year left off. You have Nik Stauskas left off, you have Cody Zeller left off, you have Keita Bates-Diop left off. I mean,
Zeller wasn't a player of the year, but he was objectively one of the 3 or 4 best players in the Big Ten when he was at least his second year. I mean, to me, it was Burke, it was Oladipo, and then Cody was right there. I mean, look at his efficiency. It was off the charts, even for both seasons.
Yeah, do you think – so I can see a case where maybe there's not 3 Indiana guys on the team. Do you think maybe it's a case where Zeller and Yogi kind of – split the
canceled each other out? Yeah, I mean, if I had to pick between the two, I'd pick Zeller over Yogi, and that's no offense to Yogi, but I just think in terms of impact to winning. I mean, before Cody got there, Indiana was basically no good, and when he left, they were only good basically one more time under Tom Crean. So the Aaron Craft thing, as opposed to comparing them to Jordan Murphy, I will say the one thing that to me differentiates it. Is that Aaron Craft was a point guard on a team that won a lot of games, and Jordan. That's my whole problem with Jordan Murphy is okay, the numbers are fine, but what everyone else on this team, on one of the first 3 teams, I would say at least did something in terms of competing for a Big Ten title or advancing in the NCAA tournament in a significant way. And to me, he's the one that sticks out as not. I mean, it's like kind of like trying to put a Northwestern guy on there. I wouldn't agree with it.
Jordan Murphy's, I would think, just looking at the list, the only one with a losing record in Big Ten games, and probably by a significant margin.
For sure.
The majority of these guys probably won at least one Big Ten title. I don't know if all of them did. Not Russell. I don't think. But either way, I think Nik Stauskas, Michigan won the league by, I think, 3 or 4 games that year. Yeah. He had an insane season. I don't really know how you overlook him on this list. You could say he's only there 2 years, but one year he started on a team that went to the national championship. The next year he won the Big Ten. I think he's a pretty obvious slight. You can make a case for someone like Jordan Taylor at Wisconsin. There's just so many people more deserving than Jordan Murphy, who just put up great stats on a bad team.
I mean, would you take? What about Sam Decker and Nigel Hayes as compared to Jordan Murphy? I mean, Jordan Murphy might have better numbers, but in terms of what those guys did individually, I don't know. I mean, I value winning. I mean, when you're doing something like this, I just can't get the rationale behind having Murphy on there. I'm not trying to take anything away from the guy. He obviously. Is he the all-time leading rebounder in the Big Ten? Is that right?
I believe that, okay, and I think that's probably the argument for him. But man, I'm going with guys
Stauskas and Zeller to me are, and it's going to sound like I'm being a homer because we have somebody that covers IU and somebody that covers Michigan on this podcast. But to me, those are 2 that definitely deserve a further look. But I mean, this is a list of a ton of great players. As you mentioned, we didn't really have much argument on the first 10. So then you're talking about 5 or 6 more spots, and there's 8 or 9 guys that legitimately deserve consideration.
Yeah, and once you get into the Sam Deckers and the Nigel Hayes, you would have to look at a Mo Vogner. I mean, he was a guy who led a team to a national championship game. I think a lot of Michigan fans would make a case for him. He kind of, I think, has the same problem that maybe Decker or Hayes have, where he played on a really good team, but it was a pretty balanced team. I don't think Mo was never a player of the year type of candidate, despite the fact that that team was really built around him. I think it's also telling how many seniors are on all these teams, just in terms of what the Big Ten is, how the Big Ten recruits, right? You have guys like Denzel Valentine on the first team. There's not really any one-and-dones, right? Evan Turner, played 3 years at Ohio State?
Yeah, Russell's the only one and done, I think. I think Swanigan stayed 2 years.
Trey Burke stayed 2 years.
Oladipo stayed 3.
Sullinger 2 years.
Yes.
But it just speaks to kind of that it's a league where experience wins. And even over the course of the decade, I think if you did an ACC team like this, it'd probably be littered with one-and-dones, right?
One-and-dones, for sure. Yeah, I mean, the Duke and Carolina thing would be a big part of that. So since we're recording this before the player of the decade is announced, who do you think that honor is going to go to? This podcast might not even come out before the player's name, but I want to get your prediction on that.
So I think it's a 2-player battle. I think it's either Frank Kaminsky or Draymond Green. I think it'll probably be Draymond just because of sort of his legacy after the fact as well. But I think you can make a pretty compelling case for Kaminsky too. Who would your pick be?
Yeah, I was thinking, Trey Burke probably is hurt by the fact that, and this is what I'm talking about. It's like he's hurt by the fact that he's done less since he's left Michigan than pretty much all these other guys. In terms of the NBA career. So I think he's hurt a little bit by that. Evan Turner, it was basically just 1 year in the decade that he was even on Ohio State.
A year. That's okay. The other thing that's hard to parse out about this is supposedly the second half of that season counts, but the second half of this season doesn't count, which is the argument I saw made to exclude Luka Garza, which is just a little bit ridiculous. And I assume that could hurt Cassius Winston too. Yeah.
I think it'll probably be Kaminsky. But I wouldn't have a problem if it was Kaminsky, Green, or Valentine, because I think Valentine that season he had was incredible when he was National Player of the Year, right?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about that earlier. I wonder if those two will kind of hurt each other in terms of going head to head on the voting. 2 Michigan State guys, and Kaminsky will ultimately prevail. That's going to be my prediction. Will be Frank Kaminsky.
Was that Wisconsin team the best Big Ten team of the decade?
I don't know. I don't have all the list.
I know, but
they were pretty darn good. That was the team that beat Kentucky and lost to Rutgers, right?
Yes, I believe so. That is the thing that I kind of would look to for this is, who had the best team over that time period? Because
they went to the championship game and lost to Duke, right?
Yeah, they went to the Final Four in 14, and then they went to the championship game in 15.
Trey Burke went to the championship game. Draymond never did, right?
No, I believe Michigan State went to 3 Final Fours, but no championship games.
Okay.
So if you're trying to figure out who had the best season, that's kind of where I would start. I feel like that Wisconsin run through that 14, 15, 2 seasons was really up there as far as one of the best peaks during the last decade as far as just overall performance with NCAA tournament performance.
For sure. It'll definitely be interesting to see how it all pans out, and at least it gives us something to talk about now in the middle of all this, where there's not any sports to talk about. But I do want to shift gears here and ask you about Michigan's offseason so far. I follow all of the other programs in the Big Ten as closely as I can as I try to keep my list of players coming and going up to date. But Michigan has had some twists and turns this offseason. I think it's fair to say. What has been your biggest takeaways of kind of the roster overhaul and basically going into next season? In your eyes, are you optimistic that things are going to continue to move in a good direction for this program under Juwan Howard?
Yeah, you basically need an entire podcast segment to recap all the roster moves and lack of moves and everything else that happened. It certainly hasn't been short on news. So the outgoing transfers, David DeJulius, Cole Badgema, and Colin Castleton all left Michigan. I think some attrition was expected, but you look at some of those guys and they would have had a chance to compete for a starting role, rotation role. So that was a bit of a shock when it happened. Michigan brought in a transfer from Wake Forest, Sean D. Brown, who is 3-year starter at Wake Forest. Obviously not a great program over the last few years, but the hope is that he will be able to get a waiver and play immediately. Sort of mixed opinions on whether he actually will. And he's more of a kind of a 2-3-4 combo, play every spot, not really a ball handler, but can make some shots. And then the other addition was Michigan brought in Mike Smith, graduate transfer from Columbia. He is a tiny point guard, but one of the really leading scorers in college basketball over the last couple seasons, was basically the entire offense at Columbia. So a lot of moving pieces. The other big moving piece that is moving very slowly, I guess, would be Isaiah Livers and his NBA draft decision, because that process is going to go through August. So it's really hard to say, well, I think this about Michigan next year, because you have Sean D. Brown's waiver and Isaiah Livers' transfer decision, which could shift, or sorry, Isaiah Livers' draft decision, which could shift things pretty dramatically in either direction.
What we do know is that Xavier, Simpson, and John Tusky are gone. How does the loss of Simpson in particular affect things moving forward? Because to me, as you know, on our annual discussions on our top Big Ten players list, I was always a big Xavier Simpson fan, just because I thought, not maybe statistically he was the best guy, but in terms of just like a guy that you want out there in crunch time to help win you a game and maybe make a steal or get a loose ball or make a great pass. He was, to me, near the top of the list year in and year out in the Big Ten. And with him being gone, it doesn't – I mean, Smith's coming in, right? I mean, but what – I guess what is the plan in your eyes to replace that? I mean, you obviously are not going to be able to, but is there hope at the point guard position moving forward?
So I'm not sure there's a better player to inherit in college basketball last season as a new head coach than Xavier Simpson.
Right.
Just his leadership and his growth as a playmaker, right? Like early in his career when he first began starting as a sophomore, his offensive game was really a work in progress, and his shtick was, I'm just going to defend the hell out of the other point guard and make my impact that way. By the end of his career, he was one of the best ball screen guards in college basketball, and Michigan's offense was basically set a high ball screen for Xavier Simpson and let him make the read and make the play. You're not going to be able to do that next year, and I think it was a luxury for Juwan Howard in his first year. I don't think the plan is going to be, okay, well, Mike Smith, go try to be Xavier Simpson. You're talking about an up transfer from the Ivy League. Up transfers have not generally performed all that well, and I think there's a chance that Mike Smith will play rotation minutes and run the team at times, but it's going to be a very different look. Eli Brooks, again, a guy who's a proven starter, but he's not really a dynamic playmaker. He played really well with Xavier Simpson because he didn't need to dribble to get into any of his offensive looks. So what that looks like next year is really up in the air. I think Franz Vogner will be looked to take a big step. I think you'll see Michigan play out of the post more. Hunter Dickinson coming in is a massive center. He's 7'1". He is one of the best kind of post-up scorers in the class. His big concern is going to be on defense. Can he move his feet? Can he get up and down the court well enough to survive in the Big Ten early? So I think you're going to see Michigan try to do some different things. One of the things you always heard last year from opposing coaches after a Michigan game was like giving credit to Juwan Howard for how he wasn't afraid to do some of the things that John Beilein did because it was what the roster was best suited to do. I think now maybe you'll start to see Juwan Howard do some of the things that Juwan Howard really wants to do, and we'll get to learn a little more about him as an offensive coach and what he really wants in his program.
I was glad you mentioned Dickinson there because he's part of this recruiting class that's coming in that's, I think, the top rated in the Big Ten. And it could have been even more highly regarded based on a couple of dominoes falling the wrong way. The first was obviously Isaiah Todd, who Juwan Howard had committed, and he's, I believe, going to the G League as one of the guys that's going to get a duffel bag of cash to go work on his game for a year. I don't know if he's actually going to – I still don't understand quite that whole setup. It doesn't seem like those guys are going to be like in the regular G League teams, but they're going to be at some academy and maybe play some games. But obviously if you can go get the money, you take it. And then the other one was Josh Christopher. Yeah, the kid that it was down to Arizona and State and Michigan. He picks Arizona State. Was the Todd decision something you think Michigan had been planning for a long time? Did it come as a surprise? And then overall, just this class is still highly regarded. Who out of the incoming guys do you see like making the biggest impact from day one?
So Josh Christopher announced he was going to Arizona State at like 11:30 on a Monday night or something like that. And then Isaiah Todd put out his press release that he was going to the G League the next morning. So that was quite a 24 hours for Juwan Howard and a welcome to the big leagues as far as recruiting. I would probably say the Christopher decision was the bigger surprise. There had been rumors that Isaiah Todd was going to pursue a professional opportunity if it came about. I don't know that he ever would have gone overseas, just given the climate and whether he would have been really recruited for that and whether the numbers would have added up. But once the G League came out and was giving more money than they'd ever been announced before, it really became an offer that he couldn't pass up. And I think that was always something he was going to look for. So the Todd thing was always kind of on the back burner. I think the idea was that there's not a lot of harm to take that commitment in the fall and kind of create some momentum in that sense. From there, though, the Christopher announcement is the one that Michigan had been basically counting on and recruiting around as if they needed to fill that kind of playmaking guard role in the incoming class. And Christopher just never came to actually fill that role. And by the time he announced, there wasn't another option. So those losses hurt, but I do think you'll see Hunter Dickinson play a big role. He's one of the only two centers on the roster, and he's really refined as far as his offensive game. The other incoming prospects are Zeb Jackson, a bit of a combo guard who struggled a bit to get playing time at Montverde. Obviously, that's one of the most loaded teams in the country, but it would be interesting to see what that did for his development compared to playing at his old high school team. And then Terrance Williams is a guy who played with Dickinson in AAU play with Team Takeover. And he's undersized, probably 6'6", and that's being generous, but he's kind of a combo forward who will do a bit of everything, really tough kid, played winning basketball. I think his role really hinges on Sean D. Brown's waiver and Isaiah Liver's decision because they kind of project to do a lot of the same things that he would do.
So I noticed you wrote something about this recently, but I was going to ask you about it even before I saw that you kind of addressed this. But how do you think the being kind of spurned there at the last minute by Todd and Christopher not coming, how do you think that changes how Michigan approaches recruiting moving forward? Because it seemed like Howard came out with, I'm going to go for 5 stars. I'm going to go for the highly ranked guys. I know they were offering a ton of like 5 stars, which is basically like the complete opposite of what John Beilein would do, where he would only offer kids after they actually visited. And June 15th before their junior year, it was just a completely different approach. But do you think this whole situation with Todd and Christopher changes anything from Michigan perspective recruiting going forward?
Yes and no. I think Juwan Howard's still going to go after 5-star recruits. He is continuing to offer most of the top prospects in both the 2021 and 2022 classes. He's also doing a better job. You have to remember, he had not been remotely involved in college basketball when he was hired last May. And think about how far along that 2020 cycle was. Most of the kids who are more in that 50 to 150 range have already been evaluated, recruited by a lot of schools. A lot of kids announced before or immediately after July. Michigan just didn't really have time to get involved in a lot of those recruitments. So what you're seeing now is he is kind of prioritizing that next tier of players. Terrance Williams is a great example, a guy who's going to be in the Big Ten for 4 years, be a productive player, but he's not on the radar for the G League. Just got a commitment today from a Chicago kid, Isaiah Barnes, kind of the same thing. fast rising prospect who's ranked around 100, who maybe doesn't have every high major offer, but looks to have the tools to be a Big Ten player. So I think he's doing a better job of prioritizing and evaluating some of that next tier of prospects. And he's going to need to, because Michigan's next couple classes are both going to be 5 or 6 man groups. You're going to need a lot of those pieces. But I do think he still is intrigued by instant impact players, whether it's a transfer, whether it's a one and done. I think that's going to continue to be a big part of Michigan's push recruiting wise. It just gives you a little more margin for error if you land a couple of more modestly ranked kids first and then go shooting for the stars.
What, in terms of Michigan players coming back to campus and all that, what has kind of been the news coming out of that? Is it been based on everything they've given out in terms of information successful? I know Indiana, since we last recorded a podcast, announced that they had brought, I think, tested 187 men's basketball, women's basketball, football staff and coaches for COVID-19 that had 0 positive tests. I'm assuming Michigan has started bringing back basketball players to campus. How is that going based on what they've said publicly?
So I believe it's been a week or two. They've kind of been gradually bringing people back. I think most of the basketball team is on campus now. The freshmen arrived, I think, this week. I know they put out a press release or said in a Zoom conference that they had tested, I think, upward of 100 football, men's basketball, women's basketball players, and I think there are 2 or 3 positive tests. I believe they were on the football team, but I'm not positive about that. So that process is underway and seems to be moving forward toward resuming activities and going through those procedures. Basically, fingers crossed and seeing what happens, I guess, at this point.
Yeah, so where are you on this whole, resumption of play? And obviously we both follow soccer, we both follow the NBA, we follow Major League Baseball. All these different things seem to be coming back. But for us, for you and I that cover college basketball for a living, we're crossing our fingers that there's going to be a season next year. How optimistic are you? Not that whether or not you or I are optimistic really matters in the grand scheme of thing of what's going to happen. But, I mean, are you optimistic at all that there's going to be a season next year? And kind of what are you watching, I guess, here as time goes on, just in terms of college athletics, to kind of give us an indicator of maybe if we're moving in the right direction or not?
Yeah, well, I guess the good or bad news is that college football goes first, and we're going to see what happens with all that. And I think decisions about college basketball will come after we've seen what happens there, right? That's the one that everyone really cares about because that's the big money. I find non-conference play to be really precarious at this point. The logistics of it just don't make sense, whether it's a exempt tournament where you have groups of teams flying commercial to random places to play games, or whether they're buy games on campus where the economy is basically set up where we pay a smaller school to come in and play, but we're going to make up for it with ticket sales. If you're not having people in the stands, how does that work?
Even if a reduced amount of fans. I mean, for example, I've looked at some of for more context on what he's saying, I've looked at some of the contracts for Indiana's non-conference games next year, like 3 of the guarantee games. They're paying $95,000 for these schools to come play. So even if they say that, in an 18,000 seat arena, 17, even if they have 2,000 fans or something small like that, you're not able to pay that money. So I agree with you. And the other thing is that you brought up the non-exempt from an IU perspective. I don't know what Michigan's playing in next year. Indiana's supposed to be in Maui. I mean, to me, it's like, all right, how many people are going to travel to Maui to watch 8 college basketball teams play during the middle of a pandemic? To me,
and how many kids are you putting on planes flying commercial to Maui where they're exposed to who knows what?
Right.
The other thing with the guarantee games is then what happens to all those SWAC schools, those NEC schools, those MEAC schools? Those athletic departments depend on playing 6 or 7 buy games, which gets you like upward of $750,000.
Right.
So that's the problem with the basketball season right now. I could see a situation where it just picks up in the second semester and plays a conference schedule, that's probably the best bet to save the NCAA tournament, right? I think, I don't know. It's going to be interesting how it all plays out. At this point, we just don't know, though.
For sure. Well, Dylan, thanks for taking the time. Really appreciate your insight as always. I'm sure at some point here later in the summer we'll get to work on our top 25 players. We might have to actually, since the content well is so dry right now, we might actually have to release that in installments of 2 players rather than 5, or player by player, so we can kind of
single
stretch
player
it out.
features.
Especially if there's a chance that we won't be seeing basketball till January. We got a lot of space to fill, but.
The good thing is we can't start on the list until August because we're waiting for that draft.
That's
deadline,
true.
right?
That's true. I didn't ask you this. What's your gut feeling on Livers?
I think he would be very interested in staying in the draft. I think he wants to be a pro. I am less clear how interested the NBA is in him. I don't really see him as a prospect who would be drafted. So I think he has a tough decision. I say it's about 50-50, but I think just the fact that if he's offered a guaranteed contract, I think he'd go. I don't know who's going to offer him that right now.
That makes sense. Well, we'll obviously be back next week for another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Again, Dylan, thanks for the time. Good to catch up with you, and we'll be back next week, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com, and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.